The palace lights glowed softly against the night, and from the outside, everything looked calm. Silk curtains breathed with the air, candles trembled like quiet hearts, and history waited without a sound. Tonight, we step into a life wrapped in beauty, loneliness, and misunderstanding, where every choice echoed louder than the last. This is not a story shouted through time, but one whispered, asking only that you listen. If these words help your thoughts slow and your breathing soften, let this channel remain with you through the night. Let the past unfold gently, like pages turning on their own, as sleep draws closer. She was born into music, soft corridors, and the gentle rhythm of court life, where footsteps echoed politely and voices rarely rose. Marie Antoinette entered the world not as a future symbol, but as a laughing child with loose manners and a restless heart. In Vienna, she was one daughter among many, running through halls that felt lived in, not watched. Her mother was powerful, her father distant, but childhood still carried warmth. There were lessons, of course, and expectations whispered early, yet they had not fully hardened into chains. At night, she slept without knowing that her name would one day be spoken with anger by strangers who had never seen her face. Even then, her life was already moving without her consent. Empires were shifting, alliances being stitched together by marriage, and somewhere between maps and treaties, a decision was made. She would leave her home. She would become French. She would be a bridge between crowns. No one asked if she was ready. Children are rarely consulted when history needs them. The journey to France felt long, not in distance, but in meaning. Each mile carried her farther from the familiar sound of her own language, farther from the rooms where she was simply herself. When she crossed the border, there was a moment so quiet it almost disappeared. She was asked to remove everything Austrian. Her clothes, her attendants, even her dog. It was meant to be symbolic, a clean beginning. But symbols have weight, and this one pressed down hard. A girl stepped forward, and a future queen was expected to emerge in her place. Versailles did not welcome her the way stories welcome heroes. It watched her. The palace breathed slowly, heavy with tradition, every wall echoing with memory. It was beautiful, yes, but beauty can be cold when it is polished too often. The floors shone, the mirrors multiplied her image until she no longer knew which one was real, and every corner held someone who knew the rules better than she did. From the first day, she learned that nothing was private here. Even silence belonged to the court. She was taught how to walk, how to sit, how to exist without taking up too much space. Her accent betrayed her. Her laughter lingered too long. Her mistakes were noted quietly and remembered loudly. Each day, she was shaped gently but firmly, like soft clay pressed into a mold already centuries old. The court did not want her personality. It wanted her obedience. It wanted her to fit. Marriage came early, before love had learned her name. The young dauphin was awkward, distant, and as unprepared as she was. They were two children dressed as adults, standing beneath a crown far too heavy. They shared a bed, but not an understanding. In the long nights, Marie Antoinette lay awake listening to the palace settle around her, wondering why something so grand could feel so empty. She smiled in public and waited in private, hoping time would soften the distance. Time, however, only made the watching more intense. Court, affection was currency. A look could elevate or ruin. A word could travel faster than truth. Marie Antoinette learned quickly that kindness did not always protect you. She tried to please, to adapt, to earn approval through charm and warmth. Sometimes it worked. Laughter followed her through rooms. People said she was refreshing, different, alive. For a moment, she believed this might be enough, that being liked could keep her safe. But admiration at court was fragile. It shifted with mood and convenience. Those who smiled in the morning might whisper by evening. She began to feel the ground beneath her feet was never solid, only polished to appear so. The pressure to perform never lifted. Every gesture became a statement. Every choice an invitation for judgment. Even her loneliness was not her own. It belonged to gossip, shaped and retold until it no longer resembled the truth. Still, she clung to small freedoms. Music, fashion, quiet friendships. These were not acts of rebellion, but attempts at breathing. Yet even these were noticed, counted, and eventually resented. The court had no patience for a young woman who sought joy without permission. They mistook her need for lightness as disregard, her distance as pride. Slowly, without announcement, her image began to change. What began as a child's confusion hardened into a quiet resilience. Marie Antoinette learned to hold her posture, to mask uncertainty with grace, to survive the endless gaze. But survival is not the same as belonging. Each night, as candles burned low and the palace hushed, she felt the truth settling in her chest. She was no longer just a girl. She was becoming something else, something watched, something spoken about, something that would soon no longer belong to itself. And so, as the night deepened and the mirrors dimmed, her journey moved quietly forward, unaware of how much weight the future was already placing upon her name. And so, as the night settled deeper into the long halls of Versailles, her story continued to unfold in ways she could not yet see. The court had its own rhythm, slow and unforgiving, like a tide that never stopped moving. Marie Antoinette learned that nothing here stayed still. Even when she stood quietly, decisions were being made around her, about her. The silence was never empty. It was filled with observation. Every servant, every noble, every passing glance carried judgment wrapped in politeness. She began to sense that her presence alone stirred reaction, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. She was expected to become French not just in language, but in spirit. Yet identity does not change on command. She missed the warmth of her childhood, the looseness of laughter that did not echo back with meaning. At Versailles, laughter had consequence. Too much and it was called foolish. Too little and it was called cold. There was no safe middle. She learned to smile carefully, as if joy itself needed permission. As the years passed, whispers began to form around her like fog, not loud enough to confront, but thick enough to obscure. Some spoke of her spending, others of her friendships. Many spoke simply because speaking felt safer than silence. Marie Antoinette did not hear every rumor, but she felt their shape in how rooms changed when she entered. Conversations paused. Eyes lingered longer than before. Affection cooled in subtle ways. The marriage, still distant and fragile, became another quiet source of scrutiny. The court expected heirs, certainty, proof of stability. When time passed without fulfillment, blame found its direction easily. She carried it quietly, even though the burden was shared. In public, she bore the weight alone. In private, she bore it silently. There were no words for this kind of loneliness, only endurance. To survive, she retreated inward. She built small worlds where she could breathe without performance. Gardens where the air felt less watched. Music that reminded her of home. Moments where she was not a symbol, just a woman trying to feel real. These moments were not escapes from duty. They were attempts to remain human within it. But humanity at court was seen as excess. With each attempt at warmth, the image others held of her shifted further away from truth. The more she tried to soften the palace around her, the harder it seemed to become. The court did not forgive innocence. It reshaped it into something easier to resent. Slowly, a story formed that she did not write, yet could not escape, painted her as distant, indulgent, careless. It was a simpler version of her, easier to hold onto than complexity. She did not yet understand how powerful stories could be, how repetition could harden opinion into belief, how belief, once shared enough, could outweigh reality. She believed that time would correct misunderstandings, that patience would speak louder than rumor, that goodness eventually would be recognized. It was a quiet hope, and it kept her moving forward. But hope alone does not anchor perception. The court was not interested in waiting. It was always hungry for the next explanation, the next face to frame its unease. France itself was changing, though the palace walls dulled the sound. Outside, pressure was building, slow and unseen, like a storm forming beyond the horizon. Inside, Marie Antoinette lived among mirrors that reflected only surface, never depth. She sensed the shift before it had a name, a subtle tightening in the air, a discomfort she could not smooth away with charm. The warmth she once relied on no longer reached as far. People listened differently. The smiles grew thinner. The protection she thought affection provided began to crack. Still, she remained composed. That composure would later be mistaken for indifference. In truth, it was survival. To break would have been easier, but breaking would have fed the very story forming around her. So she stood tall, even as the ground beneath her grew uncertain. She carried herself with grace not because she felt secure, but because it was the only language the palace respected. At night, when the candles burned low and the halls finally quieted, she felt the weight of what she was becoming. Not by choice, but by accumulation. Every look, every whisper, every expectation unmet. She was no longer just living her life. She was being shaped into something the world would soon recognize by a single name, stripped of nuance. And somewhere within that growing distance between who she was and who she was becoming, a quiet truth waited. A truth about symbols, about blame, about how easily a person could be turned into an idea. As the palace slept and the future drew closer, her story pressed forward, unaware that it was approaching a turning point from which there would be no gentle return. And so the night carried her onward, deeper into a life that was slowly slipping beyond her control. Time passed in a way that felt uneven. Days at court stretched long and heavy, filled with ceremony and observation, while years outside the palace seemed to rush forward without waiting for her. France was changing in quiet but dangerous ways. Hunger did not announce itself loudly at first. It whispered through empty markets, through tired faces, through conversations spoken just a little more sharply than before. But inside Versailles, comfort softened those signals. The walls were thick, the routines steady. The distance between ruler and ruled felt permanent, even natural. Marie Antoinette did not wake each morning intending to be careless. She woke into a world that trained her to believe distance was normal. She had been raised among privilege since birth, taught that stability came from tradition, not from listening to unrest. When trouble appeared, it was explained away by advisors who benefited from calm appearances. They spoke in soothing tones, promising that order would hold, that the people were loyal, that unrest was temporary. It is easy to trust reassurance when it comes from voices you are taught never to doubt. As queen, she was expected to perform certainty, even when she felt none. Every public appearance became a balance between dignity and warmth. Too distant, and she was accused of arrogance. Too open, and she was mocked as shallow. There was no version of herself that could satisfy a nation beginning to fracture under its own weight. Yet she did not know how deeply the fractures ran. She only felt the pressure rising, like air growing thinner. The stories about her grew louder now. No longer whispered only in salons, they traveled through pamphlets and streets. They exaggerated her tastes, twisted her moments of escape into symbols of excess. A dress became proof of greed. A garden became proof of indifference. Her attempts to carve out small spaces of peace were framed as insults to suffering she had never truly been shown. This was the cruelest part. She was blamed not for what she did, but for what she represented. In times of fear, people look for faces to hold their anger. Marie Antoinette's face was known. It was foreign. It was visible. It was convenient. Even kindness became suspicious. When she gave to charity, critics called it performance. When she withdrew, they called it contempt. Nothing landed as it was meant. Every action passed through a lens already darkened by resentment. She was no longer being seen. She was being interpreted. At court, loyalty thinned as pressure rose. Some nobles clung to old rituals as if repetition could stop change. Others quietly prepared for escape, sensing that the ground was no longer firm. Conversations shifted from gossip to caution. People listened before they spoke. Doors closed more often. Trust, once assumed, now had conditions. Marie Antoinette felt the shift in the way people stood farther from her, in how advice came wrapped in fear. She was no longer sheltered by certainty. She was surrounded by hesitation, and hesitation is dangerous when leadership is required. She wanted to believe that love could still protect her, that the affection she had shared, the generosity she had shown, would matter when things became difficult. But affection fades under pressure. When survival enters the room, memory grows quiet. People choose safety over gratitude always. This truth moved through the palace like a shadow, though few named it aloud. The queen began to understand, slowly and painfully, that her position did not grant control over how she was seen. Power, she learned too late, was not just authority. It was alignment with reality. And reality outside the palace was no longer aligned with tradition or patience. There were moments when she sensed the danger clearly. Times when unrest reached her ears not as rumor, but as warning. Yet each time, the response was delayed, softened by hope that things would settle on their own. History does not wait for comfort. It moves whether leaders are ready or not. As tension grew, her isolation deepened. Even within her marriage, distance remained. Shared responsibility did not always mean shared understanding. She carried guilt that did not belong to her alone, yet bore it fully in the public eye. Every failure felt personal, even when it was systemic. At night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the palace settling, wondering how something so grand could feel so fragile. She wondered when control had slipped from certainty into illusion. She wondered if it had ever truly been hers at all. Outside, voices grew louder. Not yet violent, but no longer patient. Inside, decisions came too slowly. Each delay widened the gap between crown and people. Each moment of hesitation became another mark against her, another reason to doubt her place. Marie Antoinette was not blind. She was surrounded by fog, crafted by distance, privilege, and fear. And fog, once thick enough, makes movement impossible. You either stand still or walk blindly forward. She did not yet know which she was doing. The story that would define her life was nearing its turning point. A moment where misunderstanding would harden into judgment, where judgment would turn into action, where the woman behind the crown would disappear beneath the weight of a symbol too heavy to carry. And as the tension pressed closer, the night around her felt less like rest, and more like the deep breath before a storm. And so the storm, long felt but never fully seen, began to take shape. It arrived not all at once, but in steps that felt almost ordinary at first. A march here, a demand there, voices gathering, then echoing. Marie Antoinette heard of it through layers of distance, filtered by messengers who softened words to make them easier to hear. But fear does not soften when dressed politely. It waits. It grows, and then it moves. The palace that once felt eternal began to feel exposed. Its grand halls, designed to impress, now seemed too open, too visible. Every window felt like an eye. Every gate felt like a weakness. The comfort that once defined Versailles began to work against it, turning luxury into isolation. The people inside no longer understood the people outside, and the people outside no longer cared to be understood. When the crowds finally reached the palace, it was not just anger that arrived. It was desperation. Hunger has a voice that does not negotiate. Fear does not ask permission. Marie Antoinette stood at the center of it, not because she commanded it, but because symbols draw storms the way tall towers draw lightning. She was told to remain calm, to trust that order would return, to believe that authority would still hold. But authority without belief is only a word, and belief had been slipping away for years, long before the gates shook. In those moments, something inside her changed, not hardened but clarified. She saw, perhaps for the first time, how little affection mattered when pressure demanded answers. The crowd did not want warmth. It wanted certainty, food, justice, proof that someone understood the cost of their suffering. She wanted to speak to them, to explain, to bridge the distance that had grown too wide. But explanations come too late when reality has already decided its direction. The story told about her had traveled faster than truth ever could. And stories, once believed, do not pause to listen. After that day, nothing felt the same. The palace no longer offered safety. Every step was watched, every move measured. The crown, once a shield, became a target. Decisions were no longer hers to make. They were reactions, forced by events moving faster than understanding. She was moved, guarded, limited, not as a queen but as a risk. The space around her shrank. The world she could touch grew smaller. Yet outside, her image grew larger than ever. She became an idea passed from mouth to mouth, stripped of detail, heavy with blame. In confinement, time changes. Hours stretch. Thoughts circle. Marie Antoinette had nothing left but memory and reflection. She thought of the girl she had been, stepping into France with hope and fear braided together. She thought of how easily she had trusted love to protect her, how she believed kindness would be enough, how she never imagined that silence could be louder than defense. She did not deny her privilege, but she began to understand its cost. Privilege without awareness becomes blindness, and blindness, when paired with power, creates distance that cannot be crossed in crisis. What hurt most was not the loss of comfort, but the loss of voice. Decisions were made about her, not with her. Her name was used without her presence. Her intentions were rewritten by others. She existed in fragments, spoken by people who had never met her, yet felt certain they knew her. Even so, she did not collapse into bitterness. There was grief, yes, fear certainly, but also a quiet dignity that remained when everything else was taken. In the stillness of captivity, she learned what could not be taken, how she chose to carry herself. History often forgets this part, prefers simple villains and clear endings. It does not linger on the long nights where a person confronts the truth of their life without distraction. Marie Antoinette faced those nights fully awake. She understood, then, that love without structure dissolves under pressure. That power without alignment invites collapse. That being seen is not the same as being known. These were lessons carved not by theory, but by loss. As her world narrowed, her clarity widened. She no longer expected rescue from affection. She no longer waited for understanding. She accepted reality as it was, not as she wished it to be. There was strength in that acceptance, even if it arrived too late to change her fate. The end of her story approached quietly, not with drama, but with inevitability. And in that quiet, there was a strange peace. The struggle to be liked had ended. The effort to explain had stopped. All that remained was truth, bare and steady. She walked toward her fate not as a symbol, but as a woman who had finally seen the world clearly. The tragedy was not only in how her life ended, but in how late understanding arrived. Yet understanding, even late, has weight. And as the night deepened around her final days, her story left behind something more lasting than rumor or rage. It left a warning, a lesson whispered through time about power, distance, and the cost of believing that love alone can hold a world together. And in that lesson, her voice still remains. And so her story moved into its final hours, carried forward not by choice, but by the slow pull of history. The city woke that morning beneath a low, gray sky. There was no celebration in the air, only a restless silence, broken by footsteps and murmurs. Marie Antoinette rose early. She dressed without ceremony. The mirrors no longer mattered. Titles no longer followed her. What remained was the weight of awareness, settled deep and calm. Fear had not vanished, but it no longer ruled her. When everything has already been taken, fear loses its grip. As she was led forward, she felt the eyes of the crowd, but they no longer felt personal. They were watching an ending, not a woman. The distance between who she was and what she represented had never been wider. Yet inside her, something was whole. She had nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend. The struggle to be understood had ended, and with it, a strange kind of peace arrived. She thought of her children, of the quiet moments when the world felt small and human, of laughter that once existed before it became dangerous to show joy. These memories did not weaken her. They anchored her. They reminded her that her life was more than its final chapter. History often frames endings as moments of justice or revenge. But standing there, There was no sense of balance being restored. Only loss. Loss layered upon loss. A nation breaking from its past without fully knowing what it was stepping into. A woman paying not only for her choices, but for a system that had failed to adapt. The crowd did not see this complexity. Crowds rarely do. They move on feeling, not nuance. On stories repeated until they harden into truth. Marie Antoinette understood this now with painful clarity. She was not hated for who she was, but for what she symbolized in a time that needed someone to blame. In her final moments, she did not curse the world. She did not plead. She stood with the quiet dignity that had taken her a lifetime to earn. The same dignity that had once been misunderstood as distance now revealed itself as strength. Strength not of power, but of presence. When it was over, silence followed. Brief, uneasy. The kind of silence that arrives when something irreversible has happened. And then the world moved on as it always does. New leaders rose. New promises were made. New mistakes waited patiently to be repeated. But her story did not end there. It lingered, not in the details of her execution, but in the questions it left behind. About leadership without listening. About privilege without awareness. About the fragile nature of love when it is asked to carry weight it was never meant to hold. Marie Antoinette became a lesson wrapped in tragedy. A reminder that distance can be as dangerous as cruelty. That comfort can blind even the well-meaning. That power must rest on structure, not affection. These truths did not belong to her alone. They belonged to every era that followed. Over time, the sharp edges of her image softened. Historians looked again. They found not a monster, but a human shaped by forces larger than herself. A young woman placed into a role she was never prepared to navigate alone. A symbol built by others, then destroyed for it. There is something deeply human in that arc. The way expectations rise faster than understanding. The way stories flatten complexity. The way people confuse warmth with protection, and tradition with stability. Her life warns us quietly, without shouting, that kindness without clarity is fragile. That power without grounding invites collapse. And yet, there is also grace in how she faced the end. Grace born not from perfection, but from acceptance. She did not escape her fate, but she met it awake. That matters. As the years passed, her name continued to echo, reshaped by each generation that spoke it, sometimes as a caution, sometimes as a symbol of excess, sometimes as a misunderstood figure caught between worlds. Each version revealed more about those telling the story than about her herself. Tonight, as this story settles into stillness, it asks nothing from you but reflection, to consider how easily distance grows, how quietly pressure builds, how important it is to listen before voices rise too loud to ignore, and how dangerous it can be to believe that love alone will hold when reality demands structure. Marie Antoinette's life was tragic not because it ended, but because understanding arrived too late to change its course. Yet that understanding remains, waiting for those willing to hear it. And so, as the night grows quiet again, her story rests, not as a warning shouted in anger, but as a lesson whispered through time. If you'd like, we can now gently close this documentary with a final reflection, or begin shaping the next bedtime history together.